Daniel always worried about what would happen when you became dependent on us, my daughter-in-law said beside my son's casket, loud enough for every person in the church to hear. I remember the exact way the room fell silent after those words. Even the organ music seemed to disappear into the walls. At 71 years old, I had buried my husband, survived cancer scares, and spent 40 years helping my son build the life he dreamed of. But nothing had prepared me for the humiliation of standing at my only child's funeral while his widow quietly turned me into a burden in front of everyone we knew. I kept my hands folded tightly over my black leather purse so no one would notice they were shaking. Vanessa stood there in a tailored dark gray dress, her blonde hair perfectly pinned back, one manicured hand resting against the polished wood of Daniel's casket as though she were the grieving wife from a movie. People looked at her with sympathy. They looked at me with something worse. Pity. Vanessa, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't the time. She gave me a tight smile without warmth. I'm only saying Daniel worried about you, Helen. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of. Taken care of. As if I were some confused old woman who needed help remembering where she lived. My son Ethan shifted awkwardly near the front pews, pretending not to hear. He was only 17, tall like Daniel, with the same nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck whenever tension filled a room. I couldn't blame him for staying quiet. Everyone in that church seemed afraid of Vanessa. The funeral ended under a cold October sky in Connecticut. The wind carried the smell of wet leaves across the cemetery, while people lined up to offer condolences that sounded rehearsed and uncomfortable. Daniel was such a good man. He loved you very much. Call if you need anything. I thanked them politely, though most avoided holding eye contact for more than a second. Word travels fast in wealthy towns. By then, everyone already knew Daniel Whitmore had died in a late-night car accident on the interstate 3 days earlier. Everyone also knew he had left behind a company worth millions. What nobody knew was that my son had started calling me almost every evening during the past year, usually after Vanessa had gone to bed. He sounded exhausted during those calls. Nervous. Sometimes he would stop speaking mid-sentence, like someone had entered the room beside him. The drive back to the house felt endless. Vanessa rode in the front passenger seat beside the driver while I sat alone in the back of the black SUV, staring out at the gray coastline passing by the window. Daniel's house had once felt warm to me. I remembered Christmas mornings there, the smell of cinnamon pancakes, Ethan running through the hallways in socks too big for his feet, Daniel laughing while carrying stacks of presents into the living room. But when we arrived after the funeral, the house felt different. Cold. Organized. Almost staged. Vanessa removed her gloves and turned toward the guests gathering around the dining room. Dinner is ready, she announced smoothly. Please, everyone sit wherever you're comfortable. I stepped toward my usual chair near the fireplace, the one Daniel always saved for me during family dinners. But I stopped when I saw Vanessa's purse sitting there. My place setting had been moved to the far end of the table beside the kitchen door. No one said a word about it. Not even Ethan. I sat down quietly while silverware clinked against china plates and low conversations filled the room around me. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa lifted her wine glass gently and smiled at the guests. Daniel always carried so much responsibility on his shoulders, she said, especially worrying about what would happen if Helen could no longer manage things alone. Several people glanced toward me. One woman lowered her eyes immediately in embarrassment. Another gave me the same tight smile people reserve for strangers in hospital waiting rooms. I felt heat crawl into my face, but I refused to cry. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and continued calmly. Daniel wanted me to help organize certain financial matters after today. It's what's best for everyone. That was the moment I realized this dinner had never been about grief. It was about control. And somehow, sitting there beneath the soft chandelier light, while my son's favorite jazz record played quietly through the speakers, I understood something even worse. Vanessa had already started removing me from my own family before Daniel's grave was even covered with dirt. I barely slept that night. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and fresh paint, as though someone had prepared it long before Daniel died. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed sometime around 3 in the morning staring at the framed watercolor prints hanging above the dresser. None of them belonged to me. None of the blankets smelled like home. Across the hallway, behind the closed double doors of what used to be my bedroom, I could hear Vanessa moving around quietly. Drawers opening. Closet doors sliding shut. The soft sound of hangers clinking together. She was reorganizing my life before my son had even been gone a full week. By sunrise, the house was silent again. I changed into a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks before walking downstairs. The kitchen counters were spotless except for a single cup of coffee sitting beside Vanessa's tablet. She looked up briefly when I entered. "You are awake early," she said casually without smiling. "I have always been an early riser," I replied. She tapped something on her screen. "I made oatmeal if you want some." It was not really an offer. More like an obligation she needed witnesses for later. I poured myself coffee instead. My hands still felt unsteady every time I thought about Daniel's funeral. Or worse, the way people had looked at me afterward. Vanessa closed her tablet slowly. "A few people from the company may stop by later this afternoon," she said. "Daniel handled most things personally, so there is a lot to organize." I nodded quietly. Daniel had founded Whitmore Tech Solutions nearly 20 years earlier from a cramped office over a hardware store in Stamford. I remembered bringing him sandwiches during those first impossible months when he worked 16-hour days and slept on a couch beside his desk. Back then, Vanessa had not even been in the picture. "I think it would be easier if you stayed upstairs while they are here," she added carefully. "The meetings could become stressful." I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. Stressful for whom? For the first time, her polished expression tightened slightly. "Helen, nobody is trying to upset you. We are only trying to move forward responsibly." Move forward. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something she had already repeated to lawyers and financial advisors behind closed doors. Before I could answer, Ethan entered the kitchen wearing sweatpants and one of Daniel's old Yale sweatshirts. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Morning, Grandma," he said softly. I smiled for the first time in days. "Good morning, sweetheart." Vanessa immediately stood and straightened his collar as though he were still 10 years old. "Do not forget your appointment this afternoon," she told him. Ethan pulled slightly away from her touch. "I know." The tension between them lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Vanessa noticed me noticing it too. Ethan grabbed a banana from the counter and glanced at me carefully. "Grandma, maybe later we could look through some old pictures of Dad together." Before I could respond, Vanessa interrupted smoothly. "Helen has had enough emotional stress for now." Ethan frowned. "I was only asking. And I am only protecting her," Vanessa replied. Her voice remained perfectly calm, which somehow made it worse. After breakfast, I walked outside to clear my head. The October air felt cold against my skin as I wandered through the backyard overlooking Long Island Sound. Daniel had built this house 12 years earlier after the company became successful. He used to joke that he bought the property because I loved the ocean. I remembered summer evenings sitting beside the fire pit while Ethan roasted marshmallows and Daniel talked about expanding the business West Coast someday. Standing there alone now felt unbearable. When I returned inside through the garage entrance, I froze. 2 movers were carrying boxes down the hallway from my old bedroom. One of the boxes had my name written across the side in black marker. "Excuse me," I said sharply. The younger mover looked confused. "Ma'am, we were told these items were being relocated to storage." My chest tightened. "Who told you that?" Vanessa appeared at the top of the staircase before he could answer. "I did," she said calmly. "The upstairs closet space needs reorganizing." I stared at her in disbelief. "Those are my things. And they will still be your things," she replied. "Just somewhere more practical." Practical. That word again. Everything about her sounded sanitized, polished, harmless on the surface. But underneath every sentence was the same message. "You do not belong here anymore." I opened my mouth to argue, but my phone buzzed inside my sweater pocket before I could speak. I glanced down expecting another condolence message from some distant relative. Instead, my breath caught. The notification showed a voicemail time-stamped the night Daniel died, just 43 minutes before the accident. And somehow, in the chaos of the past few days, I had never listened to it. I stood alone in the hallway staring at the voicemail notification while the movers carried boxes past me like I was invisible. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The timestamp showed 10:17 that night. Daniel's accident had happened just after 11. For a moment, I could not breathe. My fingers trembled as I pressed the screen against my chest instead of opening it immediately. Some part of me was afraid of hearing my son's voice again. afraid it would make his death feel real in a way I still could not accept. Helen. Vanessa's voice drifted down the staircase. Is everything all right? I looked up at her carefully. She stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, one hand resting against the railing, watching me too closely. Just another condolence message, I lied quietly. Something unreadable flickered across her face before she smiled again. You should try to rest this afternoon. Rest. That word was beginning to sound like a command. I slipped the phone into my sweater pocket and walked toward the back patio without another word. The ocean air outside felt colder now, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I sat down in one of the wicker chairs overlooking the water and finally pressed play. For 2 seconds there was only static. Then I heard Daniel breathing unevenly into the phone. Mom, he said quietly, and the sound of his voice nearly broke me. I do not know if I am overreacting, but if something happens to me, do not sign anything Vanessa gives you. Promise me. I froze completely. In the background I could hear traffic and the faint hum of his car engine. There are things about the company you do not know, he continued. I was trying to fix them before. He stopped suddenly, as though reconsidering what to say. Just promise me you will talk to Mr. Bennett first. He knows everything. The message ended there. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. I replayed it 3 times trying to understand what I had missed. Mr. Bennett. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Arthur Bennett had been Daniel's private attorney for nearly 15 years. He handled corporate matters, property records, trust accounts. Daniel trusted him completely. A cold feeling settled over me as I stared out at the gray water. Why would Daniel leave a message like that hours before he died? And why had he sounded frightened? The patio door slid open behind me. Ethan stepped outside holding 2 mugs of coffee. I thought you might want this, he said softly. I accepted the cup with both hands. Thank you, sweetheart. He sat beside me quietly for a moment before speaking again. Mom has been acting strange since Dad died. I turned toward him carefully. Ethan lowered his voice. Yesterday I heard her arguing on the phone with somebody about account access. She thought I was upstairs. Did she say who she was talking to? He shook his head. No, but she keeps asking where Dad stored certain documents. My stomach tightened. What kind of documents? Financial stuff, I think. She went through Dad's office until almost 2 in the morning. He hesitated before adding, Grandma, I do not think Dad told Mom everything. Before I could answer, Vanessa's voice suddenly echoed from inside the house. Ethan, your tutor will be here soon. Ethan immediately stood, tension returning to his shoulders. I should go. He paused before walking away. Dad trusted you more than anybody, he said quietly. Do not let Mom pressure you into signing anything. After he disappeared inside, I sat there gripping the coffee mug while the pieces in my mind slowly began connecting together. Daniel's warning. Vanessa's sudden control over the house. The movers clearing out my bedroom. The closed-door meetings. The strange calls. It no longer felt like grief alone hanging over that house. It felt like preparation. And for the first time since my son's funeral, I stopped feeling like a helpless old woman being pushed aside. Instead, I began to wonder exactly what Vanessa was so desperate to hide. That evening the house filled with lawyers, accountants, and executives from Daniel's company. Yet somehow I had never felt more alone inside it. I stayed upstairs at first exactly the way Vanessa wanted, sitting beside the small window in the guest room while black luxury cars arrived one after another in the driveway below. Men in tailored coats carried leather briefcases through the front door, while Vanessa greeted each of them with controlled elegance, touching arms lightly, lowering her voice at the right moments, playing the role of grieving widow so perfectly it almost looked sincere. Around 7 o'clock, I heard laughter downstairs. Not loud laughter. Careful laughter. The kind people use at business dinners when money is involved. I looked around the tiny guest room again and suddenly remembered the first apartment Daniel rented after graduating from college. It had peeling wallpaper, unreliable heat, and a refrigerator that buzzed all night long. I used to bring groceries there every Sunday because he refused to spend money on himself while building the company. One day I am going to buy you a house overlooking the water, he told me back then. You deserve peace after everything you sacrificed for me. He kept that promise years later when he built this home, which was why sitting hidden upstairs while strangers discussed his future downstairs felt unbearable. I quietly walked into the hallway and stopped near the staircase where their voices drifted upward from the dining room. We need quick stabilization before shareholders panic, one man said. Another replied, Mrs. Whitmore assured us the transition will remain private. Mrs. Whitmore. They meant Vanessa now, not me. I gripped the banister harder. Then I heard Vanessa speaking clearly. Daniel had been overwhelmed for months. Toward the end, he was not making the best financial decisions. My stomach turned cold. That was not true. Daniel had been stressed lately, yes, but careless was the last thing he had ever been. Another voice asked carefully, did he finalize the restructuring paperwork before the accident? There was a brief silence before Vanessa answered. Not completely, but I am handling it. Something about her tone unsettled me instantly. She sounded too prepared, too confident. I stepped back quietly before anyone noticed me listening and returned to the guest room with my pulse racing. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft knock at my door. Ethan slipped inside, holding a small cardboard box against his chest. I found this hidden in Dad's office closet, he whispered. Mom does not know I took it. I looked at the box carefully. Inside were old photographs, legal folders, and a navy blue notebook with Daniel's handwriting across the front. Ethan lowered his voice even more. Grandma, Dad and Mom were fighting a lot before the accident. I looked up sharply. About what? Ethan hesitated. Money mostly. And the company. He sat beside me on the edge of the bed. About 3 weeks ago, I heard Dad say he could not trust her anymore. My chest tightened painfully. Ethan rubbed his forehead nervously. Mom kept asking him to transfer things into joint control. Dad refused. I slowly opened the notebook. Most of the pages contained business notes I barely understood, but near the back, I found something different. Several handwritten dates. Wire transfers. Property references. Then one sentence underlined twice in black ink. If anything happens unexpectedly, Bennett has full instructions. I stared at the words while my mind raced. Ethan looked frightened now. Grandma, do you think Dad knew something bad was going to happen? I immediately shook my head. No, sweetheart. Your father was cautious, that is all. But even as I said it, I remembered the tension in Daniel's voicemail, the hesitation in his voice, the warning not to sign anything Vanessa gave me. Downstairs, I suddenly heard footsteps moving toward the staircase. Ethan quickly stood. A second later, Vanessa's voice echoed through the hallway. Ethan, where are you? He looked at me anxiously. I closed the notebook immediately and slid it beneath a folded blanket on the bed beside me. Then I squeezed his hand gently. Do not say anything about this box, I whispered. Ethan nodded once, just as the doorknob slowly began to turn. The doorknob stopped turning the moment Vanessa heard our voices inside the room. A second later, she knocked lightly instead, her tone smooth and controlled again. Ethan, your tutor is waiting downstairs. Ethan glanced at me nervously before opening the door, just enough to step outside. Vanessa stood there wearing the same composed expression she wore in front of the funeral guests, but her eyes immediately moved past him into the room behind us. Searching, calculating. I did not realize Helen was still awake, she said pleasantly. It has been a difficult few days for everyone. I smiled faintly without standing. Grief does not always make sleep easy. She studied me for one quiet second too long. Then her gaze shifted toward the folded blanket beside me where the notebook was hidden underneath. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face calm. Vanessa finally looked back at Ethan. You should not overwhelm your grandmother tonight. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. We were only talking about Dad. Exactly, she replied softly. And emotions are fragile right now. She waited until Ethan walked downstairs before stepping fully into the room herself and closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking shut made my stomach tighten. Vanessa folded her arms carefully. I know this adjustment has been difficult for you. Adjustment. As though my son's death were some temporary inconvenience everybody simply needed to organize around. But eventually we will need to discuss practical matters. I looked at her evenly. What kind of practical matters? The estate. The company. Living arrangements. Her voice remained calm, but every word felt rehearsed. Daniel carried a great deal of financial responsibility, and there are legal complications you may not fully understand. There it was again. The quiet suggestion that I was too old, too emotional, too confused to manage my own affairs. I had heard that tone before from men in banks decades ago, when women still needed husbands to co-sign loans. Vanessa walked slowly toward the window, overlooking the dark shoreline. You have had a comfortable life because of Daniel, she continued. Now we have to think realistically about the future. I stared at her in disbelief. Comfortable life. As though I had not worked double shifts as a nurse for years after my husband died. As though I had not refinanced my own home to help Daniel start his company when banks refused him funding. Vanessa turned back toward me. I have already scheduled a meeting with financial advisors tomorrow afternoon. There will be documents requiring signatures. My mind instantly flashed back to Daniel's voicemail. Do not sign anything Vanessa gives you. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. I would prefer to speak with Arthur Bennett first. For the first time since entering the room, Vanessa's expression cracked. Only slightly. But enough. Arthur Bennett, she repeated too quickly. Why would you involve him? Daniel trusted him. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before the polite smile returned. Of course. But Arthur handles complicated corporate structures. He tends to make simple things unnecessarily stressful. Simple things. Like millions of dollars. Like control of Daniel's company. Like my future. She moved toward the door again, but paused before leaving. Helen, she said softly. I truly hope we can avoid misunderstandings during this difficult time. Families can become divided very easily after a loss. The sentence sounded almost like a warning. After she left, I immediately locked the bedroom door and pulled the notebook back out from beneath the blanket. My hands trembled slightly as I continued turning pages under the dim bedside lamp. Most entries still looked like business records, but near the final pages I found copies of transfer authorizations clipped together with a handwritten note from Daniel. If Vanessa pressures Mom after my death, Bennett activates protection immediately. My throat tightened painfully. Protection from what? Before I could think further, another folded document slipped loose from the back cover and landed in my lap. It was dated just 11 days before Daniel's accident. At the top of the page were two words that made my entire body go cold. Confidential divorce consultation. I did not sleep at all after finding the divorce document. I sat awake in the guest room with Daniel's notebook open on my lap, while the digital clock beside the bed crept from 2 in the morning to nearly 6. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured my son sitting alone somewhere drafting plans to leave his marriage while pretending everything was normal inside this house. The realization hurt more than I expected. Daniel had always protected people he loved, sometimes to his own detriment. Even as a child, he hid his struggles because he thought shielding others was kindness. When his father died unexpectedly 23 years earlier, Daniel was only 27. Yet he spent the entire funeral comforting me instead of grieving himself. Now I wondered how long he had been carrying this burden alone before the accident. Just after sunrise, I carefully folded the divorce papers back into the notebook and hid everything inside my suitcase beneath several sweaters. Then I quietly left the room before anyone else woke up. The house still smelled faintly of candle wax and funeral flowers. I slipped through the side entrance into the garage and called a taxi from my phone. 40 minutes later, I sat in the back seat watching downtown Stamford pass by through rain-streaked windows while my thoughts raced faster than the traffic. I had not told Vanessa where I was going. For once, I wanted answers before she could control the conversation. The office building housing Arthur Bennett's law firm stood across from the harbor in an older brick tower Daniel always admired because he said it looked trustworthy. I remembered him joking once that modern glass skyscrapers made everyone look guilty. My chest tightened painfully at the memory as I stepped into the marble lobby. The receptionist recognized my name immediately. Mrs. Whitmore, she said softly, standing up from behind the desk. Mr. Bennett has been expecting you. Expecting me. Those words sent a chill through me. A few minutes later, Arthur Bennett himself entered the conference room carrying a thick black folder. He looked older than I remembered, his silver hair thinner now, his shoulders heavier, but the sadness in his eyes seemed genuine. Helen, he said quietly, taking both my hands. I am deeply sorry about Daniel. I nodded, suddenly too exhausted for formalities. Arthur closed the conference room door carefully before sitting across from me at the long oak table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached into my purse and placed the folded divorce consultation papers in front of him. Arthur's expression darkened immediately. You found this. Daniel was planning to leave her, I whispered. Arthur removed his glasses slowly. Yes. The single word hit me harder than I expected. How long did you know? About 2 months. He sighed heavily. Daniel discovered financial irregularities tied to company accounts and several private investments. He believed Vanessa had been pressuring him to transfer additional control over assets she legally could not access. My stomach tightened. Was she stealing from him? Arthur chose his words carefully. Daniel believed certain transactions required investigation. I leaned back slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Suddenly, so many strange moments from the past year made sense. Daniel's stress, the late-night phone calls, the tension inside the house. Arthur opened the black folder in front of him. Before his death, Daniel established multiple protective legal structures. He slid several documents toward me across the table. Trust accounts, corporate voting protections, asset restrictions. I stared at the pages without fully understanding them. Arthur lowered his voice. Helen, Daniel did not trust Vanessa with control of the company or the estate. I looked up sharply. Then who did he trust? Arthur met my eyes. Directly. You. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the harbor while my mind struggled to process what he had said. Arthur continued carefully. Under the trust agreement, you are the primary controlling beneficiary for the Whitmore family assets until Ethan reaches 30 years old. I stared at him in disbelief. Vanessa does not know this. No, Arthur replied. At least not yet. My hands began trembling again, but this time not from grief. For the first time since Daniel died, I understood why Vanessa had been watching me so closely. Why she wanted signatures immediately. Why she kept trying to isolate me upstairs while meetings happened downstairs. Because if what Arthur was saying was true, then despite all her confidence, all her polished control, and all her careful manipulation, Vanessa Whitmore was not the person who truly controlled my son's fortune. I was. The taxi ride back to the house felt completely different from the ride into the city that morning. A few hours earlier, I had left feeling frightened, isolated, and uncertain about my future. Now I sat quietly in the back seat, holding copies of trust documents inside my purse while the rain cleared over the Connecticut coastline. Daniel had known exactly what he was doing before he died. He had seen something in his marriage that terrified him enough to build an entire legal wall around his company, his assets, and most importantly, around me. Yet despite the power those documents gave me, I did not feel triumphant. I only felt heartbroken for my son. By the time I arrived home, several luxury cars were parked outside again. Through the dining room windows, I could see Vanessa entertaining two executives from Whitmore Tech Solutions. She was smiling gracefully while pouring coffee, every movement polished and elegant, but the second I walked through the front door, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Helen, she said quickly, standing up from the table. Where have you been? Her tone sounded casual, but her eyes were sharp with anxiety. I removed my coat slowly. I went into town. Without telling anyone. One of the executives lowered his gaze awkwardly into his coffee cup. Vanessa immediately softened her expression again, as though remembering she had an audience. I was worried about you, she added gently. Your phone went straight to voicemail. I had turned it off intentionally during my meeting with Arthur Bennett. I needed some air, I replied calmly. Vanessa studied my face carefully, searching for something. Fear flickered behind her composure for the first time since Daniel's funeral. Well, she said after a pause, we have been discussing the company transition. I glanced toward the executives seated at the table. Both men suddenly looked uncomfortable. Transition? I asked quietly. Vanessa stepped closer. There are urgent financial matters requiring immediate signatures. She lowered her voice slightly. I already prepared the paperwork upstairs. There it was again. Pressure. Urgency. Control. But this time I finally understood why she was rushing. Before I could answer, her phone rang sharply against the kitchen counter. Vanessa excused herself and stepped into the hallway. A moment later, I heard her voice rise unexpectedly. What do you mean frozen? A silence followed while the person on the other end continued speaking. Then came another sentence, quieter but edged with panic. That is impossible. I authorized the transfer yesterday. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Arthur had warned me certain protective measures would activate the moment he formally updated the trust controls that morning. Vanessa re-entered the dining room seconds later, but her calm mask was beginning to crack. Excuse me, she told the executive stiffly before turning toward me again. Helen, I need to speak with you privately. I followed her into Daniel's office at the far end of the hallway. The moment the door closed, her tone changed completely. Did you speak with Arthur Bennett today? She demanded. I looked around the office slowly instead of answering immediately. Daniel's framed degrees still hung on the walls beside photographs of company award dinners and charity galas. Yet now the room felt colder somehow, stripped of his presence. Vanessa stepped closer. Helen, I finally met her. Eyes. Yes, I did. Her face drained of color so quickly it startled me. What exactly did he tell you? I remembered the frightened exhaustion in Daniel's voicemail. I remembered the divorce papers hidden in my suitcase upstairs. I remembered the years I spent trusting this woman simply because my son loved her. Enough, I replied quietly. Vanessa stared at me for several long seconds before trying to recover her composure. You do not understand how complicated these legal structures are. Actually, I interrupted softly, I understand more than you think. That was the moment I saw genuine fear appear in her eyes for the very first time. Not grief, not frustration, fear. And somehow, standing in my dead son's office while rainwater slid slowly down the dark windows behind us, I realized something important. Vanessa had spent days trying to convince everyone that I was weak, confused, and dependent because she never imagined the one person Daniel trusted most had been me all along. Vanessa did not speak to me for the rest of that evening unless other people were nearby. In front of the executives, she returned to her polished performance, discussing market stability and investor confidence with careful professionalism, while servers from a catering company quietly replaced untouched trays of food around the dining room. But every time our eyes met across the room, I could feel the tension underneath her composure tightening like wire. She knew something had changed. She simply did not know how much I knew yet. Around 8:30, the executives finally left, their black sedans disappearing down the wet driveway one after another. The moment the front door closed behind the last guest, the atmosphere inside the house shifted instantly. The warmth vanished. Vanessa stood near the fireplace with a crystal wine glass in her hand, staring at me in complete silence. Ethan quietly excused himself upstairs without even being asked. Smart boy. He could feel the storm coming too. I remained seated in the living room armchair beside the windows overlooking the ocean while pretending to read one of Daniel's old business magazines. Vanessa finally broke the silence. Arthur, Bennett had no right discussing confidential matters with you. I slowly lowered the magazine into my lap. Daniel clearly disagreed. Her jaw tightened. Daniel was emotionally unstable toward the end. The sentence hit me like ice water. I looked at her carefully. Do not talk about my son that way. She crossed the room toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. You have no idea what these last months were like, she snapped quietly. He stopped trusting everyone. He became paranoid about the company, the finances, even our marriage. I thought about the divorce consultation papers hidden upstairs in my suitcase. About the frightened voicemail Daniel left me before he died. Maybe he had reasons, I replied calmly. Vanessa's face hardened completely now. The careful grieving widow mask finally slipping away. You always hated me, she said. Even after everything I did for this family. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Everything you did. I built this life with him, she shot back. I supported him for years while he worked nonstop. I raised Ethan while Daniel obsessed over business deals and shareholder meetings. Her voice trembled now, though not from sadness. From anger. And now suddenly you walk into one meeting with Arthur Bennett and think you understand everything? I stood slowly from the chair. At 71 years old, I was no longer physically intimidating. But something about remaining calm while she unraveled seemed to unsettle her more than shouting ever could. I understand enough, I said quietly. Vanessa stared at me for several long seconds before setting her wine glass down so hard against the marble table that red wine splashed over the rim. Do you know what happens if investors think this family is unstable? She demanded. The company collapses. Ethan loses everything. We all lose everything. No, I replied softly. You lose control. The silence after those words felt enormous. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. For the first time since Daniel's death, she looked genuinely frightened instead of calculated. Then suddenly her phone rang again. She grabbed it immediately. What now? She snapped into the receiver before listening in stunned silence. Her face lost color by the second. Tomorrow morning? Another silence. Without my authorization? She looked directly at me while the person continued speaking. I already knew what was happening before she hung up. Arthur had acted quickly. There is an emergency board meeting tomorrow. Vanessa said coldly. Apparently, certain voting authorities have been reassigned temporarily pending trust verification. I held her gaze without responding. Her eyes widened slightly as realization spread across her face. You, she whispered. Daniel gave control to you. I said nothing. Vanessa suddenly laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor in it. A 71-year-old widow with no business experience. Her voice turned sharp with disbelief. That is who he trusted over me. I stepped closer carefully. My son knew exactly who you were before he died. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Vanessa actually flinched. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Rain crashed harder against the windows while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly through the silence. Then Vanessa finally whispered the one thing that confirmed every fear growing inside me since the funeral. He was never supposed to finish those documents in time. The words hung in the air between us like shattered glass. Vanessa seemed to realize what she had admitted the second the sentence left her mouth, because her expression changed instantly. The anger disappeared. The panic returned. That is not what I meant, she said quickly. But it was too late. I stared at her across the dim living room while the grandfather clock continued ticking steadily behind us. Then what exactly did you mean? I asked quietly. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she had no polished answer prepared. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the wine glass again, though this time she did not drink from it. You are twisting my words, she muttered. I thought about Daniel sitting alone somewhere before his death, drafting legal protections in secret. I thought about the exhaustion in his voice during that voicemail. Most of all, I thought about how hard he must have fought to protect Ethan while trapped inside a marriage he no longer trusted. No, I replied softly. I think I am finally hearing the truth. Vanessa looked away first. That alone told me everything. The next morning the house felt completely different. The silence was heavier, sharper somehow, like the calm before a storm everybody could sense, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. At 9 o'clock sharp, Arthur Bennett arrived with 2 additional attorneys and a senior financial advisor from Whitmore Tech Solutions. Vanessa appeared downstairs wearing an immaculate cream blazer and pearl earrings, but the dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed her sleepless night. Ethan sat quietly beside me at the dining room table, while the legal team organized folders and documents across the polished surface where only days earlier funeral guests had eaten catered dinners, pretending our family was still intact. Arthur adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. As acting trustee under Daniel Whitmore's estate structure, Helen Whitmore now holds temporary controlling authority over all protected family assets and corporate voting interests. Vanessa immediately stood up. This is absurd, she snapped. I am Daniel's wife. Arthur remained perfectly calm. Under the trust terms established prior to Daniel's death, your direct access remains limited pending ongoing financial review. Financial review? Vanessa repeated sharply. What financial review? Arthur opened one of the folders. Several account irregularities and unauthorized transfer requests were flagged before Mr. Whitmore's death. Ethan looked up suddenly, confusion and heartbreak crossing his face at once. Vanessa turned pale. You cannot seriously believe I did something criminal. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Vanessa looked toward me then, perhaps expecting sympathy, hesitation, weakness. Instead, I simply folded my hands calmly in my lap the same way I had during Daniel's funeral while she tried to reduce me into a helpless burden. Arthur continued explaining trust protections, account freezes, and temporary oversight. Procedures, but I barely listened anymore. My attention stayed fixed on Ethan. The poor boy looked devastated. Not angry, not defensive, just heartbroken that his parents' marriage had hidden so much darkness from him. Finally, Vanessa pushed her chair back hard enough to scrape across the hardwood floor. You are turning my own son against me, she said bitterly. I met her eyes evenly. No, Vanessa, your choices did that. Tears filled her eyes then, though I could no longer tell whether they came from grief, fear, or the realization that control was slipping through her fingers. She looked around the room desperately before whispering, I loved Daniel. The sentence hit me unexpectedly hard because part of me believed she probably had once. Maybe before the money, before the power, before resentment slowly poisoned everything between them. Arthur quietly slid one final document across the table toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently, This authorizes the transfer of the coastal property trust directly into your name effective immediately. I stared down at the papers for several seconds before signing carefully. My hand remained perfectly steady. Outside the dining room windows, the rain had finally stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds over Long Island Sound. For the first time since my son died, I no longer felt like a frightened old woman being pushed out of her own life. Daniel had trusted me to protect what truly mattered. Not the money, not the company, Ethan. And as I looked across that room at my grandson sitting quietly beside me, I realized something else too. Vanessa had spent days trying to erase me from this family, but in the end, my son had already made sure I would be the one left standing.